There are some who make a life out of exploring the obscure corners of the world. Then there are those that explore the obscure corners beyond the world's edges. Those brave fools that find their way into liminal spaces, the realms between realities, where everything is just a little off. Places where, if you travel deep enough, physics and common sense become little more than polite suggestions. I am one of those fools, though I won't make any claims to bravery. That's taken care of by my traveling companion. She goes by the name of Charlotte. I haven't heard her real name yet. Met her in a Tulgey Wood, where she offered her services as a guide through that whimsical wilderness. A few strange things happened, and now she's more or less thrown her lot in with me, at least for the time being. It's a reasonable enough arrangement. She serves as a guard to my humble shop and gets room and board, and a cut of the profits in exchange. Thanks to our recent exploits in liminal biome exploration, the profits have been fairly comfortable. Still, those successes have brought unexpected attention. It began simply enough with a letter delivered one snowy afternoon, a request for us to visit an anonymous would-be business associate at their residence. Normally, I'd be inclined to use a letter like that as a bit of kindling for the hearth, but as winter had fallen, Charlotte had grown increasingly restless. She's wonderful as an adventurer, and I have seen nobody better suited to living in the wild, but living day-to-day in civil society, she's not very good at that. Neither am I, if I'm being honest. So, if only to alleviate our growing cabin fever, we resolved to pay a visit to this mysterious person. As it turned out, the residence was something approximating a mansion out in an obscure corner of the countryside. It looked like it had seen better days, but there were no glaring issues. No broken windows, no rotted floorboards, just a structure that had once been quite grand, perhaps a century ago, fading slowly and gently into a sort of senescence. We were greeted by the master of the house, and much to our surprise, it was somebody we were already acquainted with. During a recent expedition, we had collaborated with something of a self-styled collector that went by the traveling name of Scrimshaw. Apparently, this anonymous invitation had brought us to his home. As we were welcomed into the old manor, I couldn't help but think that the fellow matched his dwelling in some regards. Sharp eyes, but a bit unkempt. His usual intelligent manner of speech, though his manners were as eccentric as ever. His previously incongruous air of sophistication made a great deal more sense now, even if it remained a pointed contrast to his rough appearance. As he led us towards a room he described as the lounge, he explained that he had been truly impressed with our skills during the expedition into the deep Drakenbriar, and so he had contacted us hoping to enlist our aid once more. When asked why he had done so anonymously, he stated that his expedition would require considerable discretion. When we entered the lounge, I saw it was filled with paraphernalia from numerous liminal biomes. I recognized only half of the items at best, and some seemed quite rare. Among them were a few familiar oversized thorns taken from an especially vicious form of bramble native to a hellish region of the Drakenbriar. When we sat down together, he introduced himself using his proper name, though he requested that we continued calling him Scrimshaw, his preferred pseudonym for liminal travel. I should briefly note the reason for such pseudonyms. Depending on which liminal space you're in, giving your actual proper name can be a very dangerous thing, so it is a standard procedure to go by any number of false names. After such basic niceties were finished, he began to describe what felt like a somewhat dubious expedition. Apparently, he had recently acquired a text of questionable authenticity filled with strange imagery and a number of rather eldritch assertions. That and a number of suspiciously blank pages. It seemed to be a guide of sorts to one of the more obscure liminal realms known as the Amber Desert. When Charlotte and myself asked to see this book firsthand, he pulled it from a nearby shelf and set it on the table before us. There was no writing evident on the patterned cover of the old leather volume, no writing of any sort on the spine either. Scrimshaw claimed it was one of very few surviving first editions of the text. According to him, this obscure tome was known to scholars by the title of Cavernae Violacium Malorum, which roughly translates into the Caverns of Violet Nightmares. A cursory look through the pages revealed a number of disturbing images of considerable intricacy, along with text in a language I could not place. These cryptic entries were interspersed with a large number of empty pages as well. Perhaps a printing defect, but I suspected otherwise even then. Adding to the oddity, there were several scraps of paper inserted between these pages. Many of these were also blank, though some held handwritten text scrawled in a cramped, almost painful sort of writing. It took me a few moments to recognize these notes as being written in Latin. I didn't read much at the time. I didn't like the implications of what little I did read. When I inquired of Scrimshaw regarding what he intended to gain by this expedition into the desert, he answered that he hoped to visit these strange caverns beneath the surface, if they existed, and retrieve a suitable keepsake for his collection. He explained, somewhat reluctantly, that he was something of an outcast within his otherwise well-respected family. After a brief and largely unsatisfying career as a sailor, he had started looking into the liminal realms. He soon resolved to become a collector of sorts, gathering suitable specimens and memorabilia from as many of these realms as possible. Naturally, Charlotte asked why he would require our particular skills for this specific venture. His answer was quite direct. After our time in the Drakkenbriar, he had done some research into our prior exploits and reputations. He'd found a number of accounts of the Labyrinth Coast expedition and did a little research into the Tulgey Wood business before that. There were specific skills that he cited, and that was all very flattering, but something else he said caught my particular attention. Essentially, he had concluded that the two of us were competent enough to rely upon, yet obscure enough to be unconcerned by working with a social pariah like himself. One look at Charlotte told me her curiosity had been piqued. So had mine, in all honesty. Thus we agreed to this little expedition, just the three of us, seeking a subterranean realm of nightmares that seemed more mythical than actual. The days that followed passed in something of a blur. By the end, we had traveled to an obscure locale somewhere along the more southerly coastlines of the Mediterranean. I won't give any further details in the matter, as the residents there value their privacy. Indeed, anybody at all that has dealings with the Amber Desert seems singularly reticent about sharing its location. The realm is only open to exploration during the winter months, as summer renders it too inhospitable for human habitation. That is the case on the surface, at least. The handful of year-round residents essentially live in underground shelters during most of the year. That alone would lend some plausibility to the rumors of a vast subterranean realm beneath this harsh desert. It was a thankfully uneventful trip to the gate, which appeared as little more than a narrow gap among the barren, stony hills. It looked almost as though the particular hill had split in two in some long-forgotten cataclysm. As we proceeded through, we noticed the sunlight becoming harsher and more blindingly intense. Another thing I noticed was the slow activation of my personal photoeidetic device. As an aside, most technology doesn't work within liminal realms. The photoeidetic device is an exception, as it uses human perception to construct images in a manner vaguely reminiscent of a simple camera. I'm not certain as to how it works exactly, but I do know that it only functions within liminal realms. In mundane reality, it is altogether inert. As we stepped out into the open, I was able to capture a proper image of my first impression of the Amber Desert. It was a long walk through the Amber Desert, even if it wasn't a terribly long distance. A mere 5 minutes of walking would feel like hours under that blinding sun. The sun is much brighter in this particular realm, far more aggressive and intense, with a good deal more ultraviolet radiation. It's tolerable in winter, especially as we were prepared with suitable attire, but I can see why this place is essentially abandoned during the summer. When we reached the oasis, it was no small relief. The place was accessible through a narrow gorge descending down into the parched earth. By the time we emerged once again into the open, well, it wasn't actually all that open. The oasis felt like another world, quite distinct from the surrounding desert. There was still that faint sun-baked scent on the air, but it was all but lost beneath a heavier, earthy sort of atmosphere. Most of the vegetation here is in shades of purple rather than green. It also has an oddly luminous quality, particularly higher up in the canopy. If memory serves, this is due to a series of rather interesting compounds in the plant tissues. substances that absorb the high-energy ultraviolet photons and emit lower-energy photons as visible light, mostly in hues of indigo and violet, apparently. To put it another way, the plants bleed off the excess sunlight as a sort of bioluminescence. Whatever the exact mechanism might be, the effect masks the chlorophyll quite effectively. Some research suggests that at least a few plant lineages in this realm don't even use chlorophyll, but I've not seen any conclusive studies thus far. Enough of my rambling on the idiosyncrasies of the local flora, though, at least for now. The resident human population has been far more relevant to our experiences today. We met with one of the keepers of the oasis, a young woman in a broad hat and long robes, ideal for keeping the sun off whenever they have cause to venture out from beneath the primeval trees of the oasis. She wasn't willing to have her proper image captured, though she did agree to stand for a more distant portrait. This sect of keepers is apparently entirely female, and they are commonly referred to as the Water Witches. This is not a pejorative title by any means. If anything, they seem to wear it with a reserved sense of dignity. In the bleak desert above, there are small islands of life. Ancient trees grow in a haze of violet, keeping quiet watch over tranquil waters. The air is scented with unknown spices, more dream than substance. These shadowed sanctuaries are the domains of the Sisterhood. They do not share their secrets, but they are hospitable to polite visitors. Hospitality is a vital thing in the Amber Desert. Even the most esoteric of orders cannot afford to be altogether isolated. So these witches of the water tend to their indigo gardens, growing strange crops in the half-light, herbs that bring unearthly dreams of supernal ecstasy or nightmares of profound dread. Spices that lend an impossible flavor to even the most mundane of dishes, leaving a sweet aftertaste found nowhere else. One may almost befriend the Water Witches, but one should never take them lightly. They are not simple farmers alone, nor are they an order without wisdom. They are wardens and watchers, and they guard their secrets most jealously. We stayed overnight in a guest house, or a close approximation of one at least. The little structure was surmounted by one of the large ancient trees, leaving no break in the canopy above. As for the building itself, it appeared to be mostly carved from the underlying rock, with only a few patches of wood to secure any gaps. The rooms were surprisingly open, letting a pleasant evening breeze through. After setting our luggage in place, we proceeded to the main house of the oasis, which was another structure half buried beneath one of the largest trees I'd seen. We were treated to a pleasant evening meal with the resident witches. The food was flavored quite oddly, but it was not unpleasant. There was a purplish tinge to nearly every dish, but this wasn't especially off-putting. No other travelers were present, so we had a little more attention than I might have preferred. The witches seemed to be genuinely curious about us, that and the world in general beyond the Amber Desert. They all looked surprisingly young, which made their wide-eyed curiosity seem almost endearing. Scrimshaw managed to entertain our hosts with a few tall tales and a bit of friendly banter along the way. Charlotte also contributed her share of wild stories of her wilderness adventures, a few of which I had been present for. I must admit I remembered the events a little differently. For my part, I mostly asked questions about the resident wildlife. I quickly discovered there were no large animals in the oases, and almost no small ones either. Maybe a few insect species at most. As for the desert beyond, I was told in no uncertain terms that it was utterly devoid of life. When the meal was concluded, we offered our thanks and volunteered for whatever work our hosts might require. In the end, we helped with some basic cleaning about the place and aided in lighting a few of the lamps as the night grew heavy about us. When we retired to our quarters for the night, it was an eerily silent walk through the dreamlike tranquility. Being near water in the evening hours, I had been worried about bites from mosquitoes, or something roughly equivalent to them. As it turned out, I had no cause for worry. The night air was conspicuously lacking in flying insects. That was perhaps more concerning in its own way. At the very least, it served as a subtle reminder that we were in a distinctly different realm. After a night of troubled dreams, I awoke to an unearthly purple twilight. It seemed to be close to sunrise, though it was difficult to be certain of the hour with the sky almost entirely hidden from view. The others were still asleep, so far as I could tell, so I decided to take a short walk around the guest house. The air outside was heavy and humid, with a hint of floral perfume. I wondered idly what might pollinate such flowers, given the apparent scarcity of insect life. One or two witches were visible some distance off. They paid me no mind, so I returned the courtesy. From what I could guess, they appeared to be looking after their crops. Apparently, they don't grow plants in the familiar patterns of crop fields. Instead, most of the local herbs they cultivate grow as epiphytes on the trees. In fact, the entire oasis might easily double as farmland, but be unrecognizable as such to most eyes. By the time I returned to my room, I found both of my traveling companions were awake. Scrimshaw seemed anxious to get underway. After taking a few moments to tidy up our rooms, we departed with a few farewells to our charming hosts. Once we were back out in the desert, Scrimshaw took the book from his rucksack, and the three of us gathered close to look into it. There was a map on one of the pages, corresponding roughly with the more conventional maps of the Amber Desert. One conspicuous difference was the presence of a small, isolated oasis, too small for human habitation and distinctly absent from other maps. We set off immediately in search of this anomalous locale. After a longer walk than I would care to remember, we found the place hidden among some particularly labyrinthine rock formations. It was a smaller expanse of forest, but the trees were no less ancient, no less primeval. If anything, they seemed even older and oddly foreboding. Maybe it was due to our time in the empty desert, but the colors in this oasis felt more vibrant. It almost hurt my eyes to look at some of the more vivid foliage. Any pretense at civilization was entirely stripped away in this place, yet there was still the sense of something nearby. Something old and intelligent, watching as if from the shadows. That is an overwhelming quality of this realm, the sense of ancient things. I couldn't help but recall certain paleontological discoveries within the Sahara, hinting at a bygone land that was lush and verdant, a place long since lost to the encroaching sands, and yet a memory still persists, written into the very bones of the earth. This oasis felt like a memory from an older, wilder era. In my mind's eye, I could see the entirety of the Amber Desert covered in lush violet foliage, great forests reaching towards a sky heavy with rain clouds. Then, as the adjoining reality changed, so too did this liminal place. The rains faded away year by year, and the great titan trees withered and died before crumbling to dust. Only in a few places where roots sank deep and hidden waters still bubbled to the surface, only in these few holdouts did life remain. I felt a bit melancholy as we searched among the venerable trees. It didn't take long for us to find what we had come for, a dark gap in the rock leading into a narrow passage into the darkness below. We prepared our lanterns and stepped together into the world beneath the Amber Desert. The shadowed tunnel seemed to go down for a considerable distance before opening into a vast cavern. We were all quite surprised at the amount of light we could see. Phosphorescent growths covered many of the stony surfaces, illuminating a series of uneven pools of water. Myriad tentacular forms permeated the area, and it took a few moments for me to recognize them as some of the roots of the titan trees above. I could only marvel at how deeply they had pushed into the stony earth over what must have been countless centuries. As we walked nearer to the edge of one of the pools, I could see that the water was somewhat cloudy, with fine particles catching the light of our lanterns. It seemed likely that this underground ecosystem might be sustained by nutrients drifting down from the surface. The trees formed an obvious and abundant connection, and subterranean water flow might well provide a reliable form of nutrient transport. We doused our lanterns, for the time being at least. They might be needed later if the deeper parts of this cave system were lacking in native phosphorescence. As the warm firelight was extinguished, the unearthly purplish glow enveloped us like a strange dream. Yet this stream was not entirely untroubled. There were hints of a worrisome pungency on the air alongside the sweeter and more earthy odors. It was almost a foulness, and it seemed to be coming from deeper below. Such things might have dissuaded a more sensible expedition, but none of us three were all that sensible. Scrimshaw was actually quite excited, as the book had proven thus far to be surprisingly accurate. Charlotte was similarly enthused, though more out of a sense of adventure than discovery. So, sensible or not, we moved deeper into the earth in search of the secrets beneath this liminal desert. We've been underground for several hours now, going by my pocket watch. I feel a sense of clarity settling in, and I wonder about the food we ate at the oasis yesterday. Today, all we've had to eat are basic rations we've packed for ourselves. Whatever the cause, I've started noticing a few troubling things about this cave system. I have been underground before, on a few occasions in the past, exploring cave systems in search of unusual forms of life. The liminal cave systems are stranger than most, though I suppose that is to be expected. Thus far, the caves beneath the Amber Desert have been defying even my most generous expectations. To begin with, they're too large. The amount of open space is not consistent with what I would anticipate given my meager familiarity with geological processes. There is also a disturbing regularity in the rock formations. Each cavern we've entered has been of similar size, connected by relatively narrow passages. Even these are, without exception, more than large enough for a person to comfortably walk through. The water is also unusual. Ample pools and streams in every cavern thus far, making the air quite humid. At least the temperature isn't especially high. Perhaps the most unusual and unexpected feature is the amount of light. It seems like nearly every form of vegetation down here is bioluminescent, most often in hues ranging from crimson and magenta to violet and indigo. I cannot currently find a reason for such an abundance of living light sources. Without direct solar radiation, there shouldn't be nearly enough energy to drive this amount of biomass. One possible explanation might be the tree roots. We see them occasionally, apparently having bored their way down through more or less solid stone. That is something of a mystery in itself. Plant growth is often tenacious, but there are limits to that tenacity. For the moment, the only explanation I can begin to offer is the influence of whatever other reality this liminal realm is connected with. That being said, it seems very odd that these subterranean spaces would be so hospitable to human life. Perhaps it is merely a coincidence, but there are other intimations in that book Scrimshaw has brought along, at least if the accompanying notes are accurate. Beneath the burning wastelands is a curious expanse of habitations. Bathed in unnatural light, pools of foul water churn with eldritch life. An oasis underground, a dark mirror to the oases above. No human eye has seen the full extent of these depths. None know how far this realm descends. All within this place is tainted, the very air reeking with a mephitic miasma. The foulness is a mark of those that dwell below. One may know their nearness by the vileness of the air. Know that they see all that enter their domain. Know that none may walk the deep paths unobserved. The very shadows are alive and turn to watch whenever one looks away. I can't help but wonder if those notes are starting to get to me. I've felt the uncanny sense of being watched for some time now. Ever since we entered that presumably uninhabited oasis, there has been something. Faint, intangible, almost beneath notice, but still something like a presence. In quiet moments, I might hear something whisper, a voice too soft to make out any actual words. Then I focus, and it's gone. I've seen flickers of motion at the edges of my vision a couple of times, and I turn and there is nothing. Even if I'm careful to simply move my eyes and keep myself still otherwise, there is always no sign of whatever might have moved. It was almost a relief when we did encounter something more tangible. We were moving through a fairly large cavern at the time. They seem to be getting larger on average the deeper we descend. There was a pool half-choked with what looked like some sort of lichenous form of vegetation. Our path took us rather close to this strange copse of not-quite trees, and I began to notice an unpleasant odor on the air. It was a rotted, fetid sort of stench, but oddly chemical as well. There was an eggy sort of quality. Really, it defies description, but I was soon fighting the urge to retch. Then I felt Charlotte's hand close around mine, pulling me to a silent stop. Scrimshaw halted as well, turning to her with a curious look. She nodded forward, towards the water's edge. Following her eyes, I saw something crouching low on the shore. I wasn't sure how I'd missed it before. It was motionless, admittedly, but it stood out clearly enough once I was looking directly at it. It had a vaguely human shape, though the resemblance was passing at best. A nearer comparison might be a giant frog, but that too fell short. It was clearly amphibious, and the dimensions of the head suggested a large brain. The eyes were rather unnerving, especially when the creature turned to meet my gaze. It raised its head in a gesture that seemed almost curious, then let out a harsh, barking croak. With unnerving speed, it slipped into the water. Only a few small ripples gave any sign it had ever been there at all. We avoided water as best we could after that. None of us were fond of testing our luck with something that might easily have habits like those of a crocodile. When we found a suitable place to rest, Scrimshaw began sifting through the text, searching for something that might correspond to what we'd just seen. I'm not sure whether it was a relief when he found it. It was on a page he claimed hadn't been there before, one of the blank pages, presumably. A close look revealed the ink to be a slightly different color to what we'd seen elsewhere in the text. Additional words had also appeared on the accompanying page of notes, similarly discolored. Another mystery connected with this increasingly unsettling place. Among the noisome forms of life that swim the waters of the world beneath, none are so dangerous as the Batrachians. The name is a conceit, as no doubt they have names for themselves in their guttural, croaking tongue. They are intelligent, perhaps on par with human minds, but their thoughts flow in strange directions. There is little of sense to them, so far as we might understand it. Below the clouded waters they make their true homes. I have dreamed of entire cities lying concealed, the ancient stones slimy with aquatic growth. One cannot guess at the depths of these domains, the true scope of the caverns forever hidden from human eyes. Perhaps that is a mercy. Another mercy is the disposition of these creatures. They will attack if provoked, and they are not lacking in strength or speed. However, they seem most often content to observe. It isn't uncommon to see their eyes gazing from the water's stillness. The wisest course is to ignore them, lest you draw them in and inflame their alien curiosity. We've traveled quite deep below the earth now, passing through several vast underground spaces. There is still the sense of being watched. If anything, it's gotten steadily worse, but at least now that sense is connected to something tangible. At the edges of our perceptions, we see the luminous eyes of our watchers. There must be hundreds, if not thousands, lurking within the waters. Thus far, that is all they've done, and yet there is something more. I still catch odd shadows at the edges of my vision. The whispers seem a little louder, though still too faint to decipher. Part of me is curious about what they could possibly be saying. The more sensible part hopes I never find out. The stench of the place has become rather omnipresent now, but that oddly makes it more tolerable. The human sense of smell tends to adapt to constant stimulus, and that is no small mercy. I can still perceive the foulness with a bit of effort, but I can find little reason to do so for the moment. Scrimshaw continues to search through that book of his. Other blank pages are beginning to develop patterns, but these are as yet faded and incomplete. When I asked him about it, he noted that the supposed author of this manuscript was a chemist of some note. He speculated that they might have treated the paper in some arcane manner, such that the concealed writing might be revealed under the right conditions. He pointed out the thickening vileness in the air, combined with the raised humidity and unique lighting conditions. Any of these factors might be responsible, or it may be something else altogether. His excitement at this point is almost palpable and rather unnerving. Charlotte's growing wariness seems far more sensible to me. I can't help but share her outlook, and I am beginning to seriously question our decision to come to this place. This place becomes ever more unusual the deeper we travel. More and more we find places that don't feel subterranean. The stone ceiling is far off in these places, all but invisible in the damp air. The phosphorescence is everywhere now, filling every space with diffuse light. The stone takes unexpected shapes, forming vast, irregular pillars. If I had to compare it with anything, it feels like being in an unearthly forest. Then there are the inhabitants. We haven't seen another of the amphibious creatures, not in the open at least. They've kept to the shadows, always watching. I feel their eyes on me, but there is also that sense of something else watching. I feel almost like an insect being passively studied by a slumbering titan. The shadows still whisper, and the whispers still make no sense. But I digress. The inhabitants we've met most recently are, so far, the most unusual. I say inhabitants, though thus far we've seen but a single example. It began shortly after we most recently awoke. As we were striking camp, Charlotte caught sight of something moving behind one of the stone pillars. Slowly, a most unexpected creature emerged into view. It resembled an octopus, though the finer details of its anatomy were rather different. The eyes regarded us with an unnervingly focused gaze. Not the look of a predator, or so we hoped at least. The most striking feature was the color. The thing was a lurid magenta hue overall, with subtle patterns of pink and violet flowing languidly across its skin. For a time we simply stood there, staring at the thing as it stared at us. Then it raised one of its many arms. There was a pale, slender object in its grasp. Even from a distance I could see intricate designs on its surface. Scrimshaw commented it reminded him of a flute, before taking his book out and turning through the pages with barely restrained haste. The creature retracted its arm, and the flute, or whatever it was, vanished into its body. There was an odd squelching noise that we all found rather unsettling. Then a low, sonorous piping sound drifted through the air. It couldn't be described as music, not exactly. Indeed, it was all rather monotone with strange modulations. It took us a few moments to recognize the patterns. The thing was forming words in something that approximated Latin. In the places far below, where foul waters bubble and spectral hues paint the weeping rock, the eldritch things lurk, half-shapeless, constantly changing subtleties of form and hue, boneless and soft, yet with hideous strength within their curling limbs. They tend their fantastical gardens of viscous fungoid slime and whistle hollowly with their blasphemous flutes. When asked their purpose, all they will say is that they are the gardeners, or the groundskeepers, or the tenders of the lands beneath. They move bonelessly among their fields and terraces, flowing gracefully below the water, writhing abominably above it. Yet, despite their monstrous visage, they seem to have a most tranquil disposition. Though their voices are hollow, their words are all too fair. There is an intelligence within those inhuman eyes, signs of deep and dangerous thoughts. I asked who leads them. They would only ever say, the one below all, with a reverence I found to be most unsettling. The creature said that it was one of the gardeners. When pressed for further details, it explained that the depths were a garden of sorts, tended by this creature and others like it. They manage the fungal growths, apparently, and maintain the biochemistry of the waters. As such, they are apparently amphibious and rather athletic. When we asked what the creature's name was, it seemed puzzled. It took Scrimshaw a bit of effort to explain the attachment of a word to a person's identity. The Eldritch gardener seemed to understand this eventually, and explained that there was no tradition of specific sound combinations attached to its identity. Apparently, it didn't normally communicate using sound, at least not with those of its own species. After all, the instrument it was playing to simulate a voice was not a natural part of its body. When Scrimshaw explained the need for a name as a matter of convenience, it suggested that we call it Guide or something similar. As to its species, it appeared entirely unconcerned about a name for such a group. They simply were what they were, though the name of gardeners would suffice if we were going to be insistent. As this line of reasoning was beginning to foster headaches among us, we decided to change the subject. Scrimshaw asked the creature why it wished to be referred to by the name of guide. In answer, it explained that it had been sent to us to serve as a guide, leading us safely onward into the depths. Thus, the name was obvious enough. Naturally, I asked who had sent it. Its answer was rather cryptic. The closest translation might be the authority, though that wasn't the most satisfying answer. We began walking along, following this guide, conversing together in broken Latin. It didn't take long for it to notice our additional words to one another in English. It seemed quite curious about the unknown dialect. So, as we wandered deeper, we began teaching our guide a few basic words. Our guide had previously described itself as a gardener, presumably a label for its entire species. Well, I believe I have seen the proper garden now, and it was not as I had expected. When one typically thinks of a garden, one might expect a somewhat careful arrangement of various floral forms within the landscape. A bed of flowers here, a climbing trellis there, a few hedges about the boundaries, and so on. That is nothing like what we've seen here in our recent travels. The guide led us into a fairly large, convoluted cavern with an odd texture about the surrounding stone. The air here was positively mephitic, with a rotted, sulphurous quality that stung my eyes and left me half blinded with tears for a time. Yet I adapted to the foulness with almost alarming rapidity. As my vision cleared, I was able to take in some of the details of the unearthly surroundings. The walls and ceilings seemed solid enough, but they were stretched and sculpted into glossy, flowing shapes. It looked almost as though the rock had been half melted by some manner of prior catastrophe and left to solidify into these fantastical forms. The lurid pink phosphorescence only served to amplify the strangeness of this scenery. As my eyesight continued to recover, I began to notice subtle movements within the textured surfaces, organic, flowing movements of almost glacial slowness. All at once, it became quite clear that I was not looking at a stone at all, but rather something growing over it. With this realization, I began to notice patterns of connection within the glossy surfaces about me. The slime, for lack of a better word, appeared to be growing up out of the abundant pools of water and spreading out over every available stone surface. It drew itself out into formless tendrils, slowly writhing and grasping at the empty air in a macabre sort of dance. Our guide stopped here and there, tending to the oozing masses. This pinkish ooze seemed to respond to its touch with something almost like consciousness. In contrast, the ichor appeared to contract and withdraw itself when I tried shining a lantern close to it. I would note that in the lantern light, the slime seemed translucent and almost colorless. It appears that the vibrant magenta hues are derived entirely from some form of internalized bioluminescence. We tried asking the guide about this slime, whatever it was, but the answers were oddly unsatisfying. It felt like the creature was trying to explain something patently obvious to itself and ubiquitous within its life experience. The slime is a constant in the deep places, so it said. Given a bit of time to reflect, I have a theory of what this strange living material might actually be. The foul odor should have been an obvious hint to me before, though now it leaves me with other questions. To put it plainly, I believe this slime is a complex, dynamic microbial community based upon chemosynthesis. Given the lack of sunlight within the ecosystem, there must be some other energy source driving the maintenance of this much biomass. Stray organic material from the surface wouldn't be nearly enough by itself. So I suspect this cave system contains a significant degree of geothermal activity, largely concealed beneath the steaming pools. Sulfides of some sort or another find their way into the water and support the growth of chemosynthetic microbes. This, in turn, forms the first link in whatever food web this ecosystem might contain. The trouble with this theory, these various chemical substances are rather toxic to human life. Highly reactive, potentially quite lethal. Theoretically, we should all have long since suffocated by now. I can only guess that whatever physics the adjoining reality has, it must somehow allow for at least temporary biochemical compatibility. Even this is a stretch as theories go. It is only the absence of any better idea that has left me with this unsatisfactory explanation. Scrimshaw has found another few pages fading into view on that book, likely due to the presence of some of the toxic, highly reactive chemicals present in this environment. According to the accompanying notes, this entry focuses mainly upon the slime that now drips and oozes all about us. The implications are not comforting. Far below, the rock itself is overgrown with a spreading vileness, a foulness rising up from the fetid pools writhing across the walls, hanging obscenely from the ceilings. An omnipresent substance, neither solid nor fluid, an intractable slime of unsettling hue and elastic consistency. One might at first think it to be something akin to the scum one finds in stagnant pools, but the reality is more loathsome. This slime moves and twists, sculpting itself slowly and endlessly into blasphemous forms. Structures bubble up from the glistening nothingness and fall back into dank oblivion. The ichor is mindless, but there is a will that animates it. I have seen strange things half-formed in the slime, faces that looked at me with nauseous curiosity, yet they never persisted more than a fleeting moment. Never more than an impression, never more than a suggestion, something that might easily not have been a face at all, merely an illusion, the delusion of a raving imagination, and yet there are the whispers. I hear the whispers scraping softly at my thoughts, and I see the ichor move in time with their gentle murmurs. Mindless the slime may be, but I suspect it is a mirror for something far beneath the world. A thing I dare not consider too deeply, for fear it may begin to consider me in turn. As we travel ever deeper, led on by our inhuman guide, our surroundings ironically seem to be growing oddly familiar. The formless slime is slowly giving way to more structured growth, and that is just as well. I recall one cavern in particular where the slime had agglutinated into something that looked almost like a creature of some sort. It was only a passing glance, though, and I would be glad to find it was a mistaken impression. The magenta ooze is still plentiful, I should note. Indeed, it is all around us, to be sure, but it's more like the underlying foundation of an increasingly fantastical garden. Growths arise from the slime about us. Many have a distinctly fungal quality about them, while others remind me more of coral. There are even a few that might pass as some sort of flower at a glance, though really they seem more akin to certain sessile marine invertebrates. The change in scenery was accompanied by a change in the inhabitants as well. The batrachian creatures that used to watch us from the murky waters seem to have largely vanished. In their place, we now see a number of creatures quite similar to our guide. Granted, it is always at a distance thus far, and each of them seems engaged in some aspect of tending to their strange gardens. Recently, we've had a few rather different sort of encounters. The first was beside one of the larger underground lakes. As we navigated past a pillar of slime-infused growth, we were greeted with the curious sight of what appeared to be a large crustacean. The thing was at least half as high as a person, with cold, attentive eyes and nervously twitching antennae. It looked up at us for what felt like quite a long time, almost motionless but for a strange tick in one of its front limbs. It repeatedly combed this clawed appendage over its back as though scratching a sort of itch. Then the claw lingered for a time beneath a writhing array of jointed mouth parts. The creature abruptly retreated from us as though it had suddenly been called away by some unheard voice. When we asked our guide about the thing, it explained we had just encountered a juvenile excavator, just mature enough to leave the water properly, so it had said, but not yet differentiated into its final labor. This last statement left us all a little confused, but we were reassured that other excavators were approaching and would clarify our understanding with their arrival. It wasn't all that long before we saw another, larger example of these somewhat disturbing crustaceans. This one carried itself with considerably more confidence, though it still held a sort of nervous stutter in its movements. A scout, our guide explained, as though reading the unspoken question in our minds. There was a series of high chittering notes from the creature towards our guide, which were answered by a series of roughly equivalent sounds. Our guide explained that it was greeting us and apologizing for the false steps of the young one. We did our best to explain that such false steps didn't trouble us. Seemingly satisfied, the creature wandered off. Before we could process the matter, our guide told us we were officially invited to the nearby settlement. It appeared we were in need of rest, after all, and the excavators apparently approved of our good manners. At least that is what I would like to believe. It wasn't all that surprising when Scrimshaw noted another of the formerly blank pages, drawing my attention to a strangely familiar image. It was one of the excavators, or a rough approximation of one anyway. The thing looked a bit like a hermit crab without its shell. After a bit of searching, we found accompanying notes that made some sense of the cryptic language beside the image. In places the depths are alive with chittering horrors, chitinous things of great size and strength, monstrous forms that move with a disturbing sense of purpose. Their carapaces are draped with fungus ichor, and they carry the vile stench of the omnipresent slime of the reeking waters. Their forms are stained with colors most unnatural, blending all too well with their unearthly surroundings. These dread crustaceans act together with coordination such as any ant colony might be envious of. Their great claws scrape away at solid stone. They gnaw at the very bones of the earth, excavating new passages and expanding the established caverns. The groundskeepers follow in their wake, planting their gardens of translucent fungus. The excavators do not speak directly with outsiders, though the gardeners may serve as intermediaries. It seems their thoughts are very plain, not simple by any means, often quite intricate in fact. They fashion cunning devices and raise fabulous structures within the gloom. They are consummate builders and architects, and yet they are lacking in imagination. They do as they are told and never question the commands. When asked what commands them, they have no clear answer. Only the one, always the one. If pressed, they might go so far as to declare the one unknowable. The village, as I've taken to calling it, is not what I expected. Not that I expected anything in particular, but of all the things I did not expect, this was among the more unexpected. Enough of such aimless scrawling, though. Although these excavators have an appearance reminiscent of overgrown, unshelled hermit crabs, their society is perhaps more akin to that of a termite mound. This is reflected in the rather earthy and organic form of their architecture. A number of illuminated spires rising from the edges of various bodies of water, contained within a cavern almost large enough to feel like the outdoors. The ceiling is veiled in mist, illuminated with pale phosphorescence, evoking something almost like a dark, overcast sky. Having met a few more of the crustacean residents here, I have gained a few insights into their nature. They are roughly divided into a number of castes, centered around the continuous ongoing excavation of the caverns. These creatures are essentially sculptors of the surrounding rock. They're able to crawl up vertical surfaces and walk easily across ceilings. The sight is admittedly quite unsettling, though it is a necessary set of skills for their continuous excavation work. Most unusual, perhaps, is the dietary symbiosis I found these creatures to have. I noticed a vibrant magenta glow about each of these excavators and an oddly variable texture along their shells. Their backs seemed too smooth in places, too glossy. It felt quite obvious when I caught a glimpse of unsettling movement and recognized the slime adhering to the creatures. As it turned out, the odd tick the young one had exhibited before was simply a sort of idle snacking. The carapaces of these creatures are overgrown with a specialized form of the luminous slime the gardeners tend to. Regular immersion in the water feeds and maintains this slime, providing nutrients enough for the various microbes to proliferate. The microbes are regularly harvested and form the major component of the diet for these crustaceans. Each is, in a sense, carrying a miniature sort of fungal garden on its back. I should note that this village is inhabited by both excavators and gardeners in roughly equal measure. The former see to the underlying architecture, while the latter tend to whatever happens to be growing over it. We've had a chance to rest for a time in one of the more open chambers within one of the village structures. The air feels heavy with unspoken whispers here, and there is the sense of eyes on us from all sides. To be expected, I suppose, given the population of inhuman intelligences gathered about us now. Yet there is something more. We three have spoken quietly with one another about it now. The sense of something far below whispering up to us. At least that's how Charlotte described it, and I'm not inclined to disagree in this case. I think our guide is returning soon. There is a growing sense of expectation on the air, and the whispers, and the unseen gazes of unknown eyes. It is later now, and I am more than a little perturbed. When we had had a chance to rest for a time, we were led to a cavern filled with pale fungal growths. A large, mottled shape rested in a pool of brackish water some distance ahead of us. As we approached, our guide made a gesture that resembled a sort of obsequious bow, or at least the boneless version of one. As if in answer, the large shape slowly rose from the water, revealing a very large and ancient example of the gardener species. The thing's gaze was intense and piercing, but not necessarily unkind. If anything, there was a sense of curiosity about the eyes. The creature spoke in the whistling way of its kind, its voice slow and sonorous as it bade us welcome. We seated ourselves before the venerable creature, or perhaps I should call it the sage. That was the title it used as it spoke in its hollow, whistling voice. The tones were deeper than those of our guide. The nearest approximation might be something between a bassoon and a pipe organ, though again there was the sense of distinctly alien harmonics. The conversation began in the corrupted Latin our guide had spoken with, but soon the sage began to use our own language. By the end, it was speaking with almost alarming fluency. It asked us about our realm, we asked about its world. Eventually, Charlotte grew bold enough to ask it about the whispers. It answered that was the voice of the Great Mind. When pressed for further explanation, it could offer none. The Great Mind is the Great Mind, or so it said at least. This was not a comforting thought, though we were at least able to determine this mind was not especially malevolent. It was curious, though, and that brought us to a worrisome topic. Apparently, it had been the will of this unknown mind that had arranged our meeting. Meeting our guide, being led into the depths, now conversing with this elder sage, all of it had been at this mind's behest. When we asked the purpose, we were answered with a proposal. 3 things would be asked of us, and we could ask 3 things of the denizens of this realm in turn. Such an exchange would serve to show what sort of creatures we were. After a bit of conferring together, we asked for 3 simple things. The first, basic hospitality and accommodation while we were in the caverns. The second, safe passage back to the surface when our visit was finished. The third, at Scrimshaw's request, was a trinket, perhaps a statuette, made by one of the inhuman artisans of this realm. Charlotte and I did have a few reservations about this last request, but in fairness, it had been the original motivation for this little expedition. When we offered these requests, the sage answered with 2 requests from the unknown mind. We would travel further below to meet the eldest creatures of the realm. Once there, we were to allow them to handle 2 very particular items in our possession, my photoeidetic device and Charlotte's vorpal blade. We were assured that these 2 items would not be damaged, and they would be returned to us after a short time. When I asked what the third request would be, the answer was that it depended upon the results of the first 2 requests. After gaining further assurances that this third request would not endanger any of us or lead to any significant losses, we agreed to the terms. Thus the bargain was struck, and we were led away from the elder sage. Our guide explained that we would be given a span of time to rest. Afterward, we were to be led deeper into the caverns, to the dwellings of the elder things. I couldn't help but notice that our guide was also beginning to use more English in place of modified Latin. Now back in our resting chamber, I find my thoughts turning increasingly to these elder things. The sage we spoke with seemed venerable and ancient in its own right, but it spoke as though it was the most callow neophyte in comparison to an elder thing. We've gone through that book of Scrimshaw's a couple of times this evening, and eventually we saw something that might describe these as yet unknown creatures. As ever, what we have read has been perhaps less than encouraging. In the lowest caverns of the realm beneath, where only the mad would dare to venture, there dwell ancient creatures of baffling aspect. They are the strangest inhabitants of the realm below. They bear no eyes, and yet they see. They have no ears, and yet they hear. They appear mindless, and yet their minds are abyssal in their depth and terrifying in their reach. These are the rulers of the things below, though the word falls short of the truth. They declare through their intermediaries that they are merely vessels for the oldest voice, the one below all whose will has shaped their ways. Their thoughts are those of wisdom mingled with madness, their minds utterly inhuman and wondrously subtle. They see all things with utter dispassion. Even death seems to hold no fear for them. Then again, I'm not certain their form could ever truly die. It is too diffuse, too redundant. There are no vital organs to pierce, no crucial points to attack. Well, perhaps then that they seem so tranquil. The priestly caste, abhorrent slaves to the one below all. It seems the longer I am underground, the more my sense of day and night slips away. I can still feel the days pass, but only somewhat. This is disorienting enough to begin with, but here, in this place, it is worse still. I can feel reality itself bending the deeper we travel. The whispers are louder here, though they remain indecipherable. Yet there is weight in the hidden words, the focus of an unknown mind, such intensity, almost manic in its seeming, but only ever for a passing moment. If I had to interpret such fits of passing madness, I would suspect something is intensely curious about us, or perhaps it is simply a reflection of the curiosity I saw earlier. We were led deep below the village into cavernous expanses that seemed almost like another world altogether, as though the earth was hollow and we were looking up into endless hazy expanses. It feels almost as though we are underwater. Appropriate, perhaps, considering the creatures gathered about us now. I first saw the Elder Thing in a simple setting, just a passage of rock. At first it looked almost more like a bizarre plant than an animal, yet I'm acquainted enough with the ocean to recognize the form. The Elder Things are echinoderms. Beyond that, I cannot say much. They have the same pinkish fluorescence seen in the gardeners and the excavators, and I expect their diet is a similar microbial subsistence. The Elder Thing moved slowly, but with clear purpose. It looked at us deeply, though there were no eyes in evidence. A few graceful gestures among its many arms, and our guide bowed low. We were to be brought before the seer for the payment of our first 2 obligations. We were led deeper still, beside a strange construction that I could not capture using my device. It is as though the geometry defied seeing properly. I could make no sense of it, and so the only faint flickering images I was able to capture amounted to little more than gibberish. Regardless of these oddities, we pressed onward until we stood before a very large and presumably very old example of an Elder Thing. There was a small spark of fire on the ground before it, which gave off a scent akin to some sort of alien incense. Within the baleful light, the contours of the ancient thing were highlighted. The creature had a body with many strange nodules which seemed to be sophisticated sensory organs of one form or another. Not quite eyes, but perhaps something similar. It extended a few tendrils towards us, almost near enough to touch. Our guide then made a request on its behalf. It wanted to hold the 2 liminal devices of note that we were carrying, Charlotte's Vorpal Blade and my photoeidetic device. We obliged, for what else could we do? Each of us carefully set the items within the creature's grasp. What followed was strange and unsettling. It drew the items in close to itself, wrapping several tendrils around each. Then each of these tendrils seemed to unfold and expand, separating into a multitude of tiny appendages. These went over every surface of the items with minuscule detail, and the large body above pulsated with apparent mental exertion. After a few minutes, these motions abruptly halted, as though the thing had reached a sort of unspoken conclusion. It extended its coiling limbs once more towards us, offering back what it had borrowed. Happily, I found nothing damaged or out of place, and neither did Charlotte. As Scrimshaw asked our guide what was to happen next, I noticed the ancient creature shambling oddly away. It seemed very preoccupied, but also strangely feeble. There was a tremble in its movements that hadn't been there before. Perhaps something pathological, or maybe something more akin to excitement. We followed it for a short distance, our guide suggesting we should be on our way all the time. Still, we lingered, watching as the thing seemed to steadily grow weaker and weaker. Its vast form appeared to deflate somehow, withering away before our eyes. There was a sudden surge of brilliant light, strangely hued in the purplish pink so inherent to this realm. It seemed as though something incorporeal escaped the crumbling body of the elder thing. Then the light faded away, and we were left in the chamber not far from a withered corpse. We have been moved to a secluded chamber to wait, or so we're told. Our guide can't seem to specify just what it is we are waiting for. The nearest thing to an answer would be we are waiting for a decision. Waiting most likely to see what our third and final obligation might be. While we wait, I have turned my thoughts to speculation, trying to make some sense of this realm. I have started with the increasingly evident assumption that there is some sort of consciousness underpinning this place, the one below all as it is sometimes described. A mind, or several minds perhaps, that are influencing this place. This influence seems to strengthen the deeper we travel. This would make an odd sort of sense if the adjoining reality was below us rather than off to one side. There is no reason for any liminal realm to necessarily be stretched between two gates that are horizontally separated. Perhaps this realm, at least, has a vertical separation, with the other reality taking over deep underground. The entity, or entities, appear to be curious about life, or at least have some sort of equivalent deep interest. Particularly complex life, or perhaps unfamiliar life, like humans. Yet there should be at least a vague familiarity given the human residence at the surface. Maybe they're simply too far off, though, too distant for this entity to get a clear perception of them. If so, maybe it has been tantalized by such far-off glimpses. I cannot help but notice that this vast cave system is host to no less than 4 complicated forms of intelligent life, each quite distinct from all of the others. These 4 forms answer very roughly to 4 of the most successful and abundant lineages of normal life on Earth: vertebrates, arthropods, mollusks, and echinoderms. Each has several examples of complicated body plans among their many species. So I find myself wondering as I imagine how this place might have been many eons ago. A lush tropical paradise intimately entangled with prehistoric oceans. Clear examples of amphibious vertebrate life, hermit crabs or something similar scuttling along the shores, cephalopods hunting in the depths, even echinoderms clambering endlessly through the wet sands and brackish pools. As the climate began to change, as the deserts encroached, as the seas vanished away, could some of these things have perhaps gone underground? Did they answer some unknown call from the great mind far below? Perhaps they burrowed at first to simply escape the sun. Then, the deeper they traveled, the more this mind was able to influence them. Not just their behaviors, but their environments, perhaps their very forms. Supposing that this mind had an interest in complicated life, it might make sense if it cultivated each of these 4 lineages into something more complex. The amphibious vertebrates grew to become the batrachians. Simple crustaceans became the complicated society of the excavators. Hunting cephalopods were tamed into sophisticated gardeners. Mindless echinoderms gained an uncanny sort of intelligence, uniquely open to the alien influence of whatever lies far below us even now. Whatever it is, that mind is not finished with us. We were brought before another of the elder things. This one was the largest any of us had seen, and appeared to be ancient beyond all reasonable description. No doubt it had a formidable mind, but there seemed to be another set of thoughts laid upon this consciousness. Half of its curling limbs appeared to move in ways quite distinct to the other half. Our guide described it as the Oracle, and a speaker for the One Below All. Using our guide as a mouthpiece, the elder thing addressed us. It stated the one was pleased with our offerings and had decided upon its final piece of tribute. We are to be brought into the Temple of the Elder Things, that impossible edifice that defied my feeble efforts at photography. We will then be brought far below, to a place described as a threshold. There we are to see a new thing. That was all that was specified. We're all more than a little worried as we wait now, outside the ancient edifice. Today has proven to be surprising. Yes, surprising might be the most diplomatic word for it. After being brought inside the temple, we were ultimately led to a place far below it, a sinuous tunnel weaving through barren stone. There was no trace of slime or other growth in this seemingly sterile place. Our only light was from the phosphorescence we carried with us, yet the place did not feel lifeless. It was as though the rock itself was alive in some inscrutable fashion. The whispers at the back of our minds became worryingly clear, though the language was still unfamiliar. Maybe that was for the best. Our guide seemed increasingly out of sorts. It seemed almost afraid, and yet oddly excited at the same time. After all, it had been summoned, or rather, we had been summoned, and it had been tasked to deliver us. This was not a comforting way to put it. As we proceeded further, we could see a growing light ahead of us. This was no luminous fungus, but something stronger, something almost like daylight, as though we had descended so deeply that we might somehow emerge on the far side of the earth. Preposterous, of course, and yet the truth might not be all that far off. Within each liminal biome, there are three underlying laws at work: the law of our reality, the law of the adjoining reality, and the law of the gap between them. Travel far enough into the liminal space, and at some point the other reality's law overturns our own. Ironically enough, it is the third intermediate law that is supreme at such an inflection point. If the rules of the in-between were not ascendant there, the liminal space would fracture, and each adjoining reality would retreat into itself. The trouble with the law of the in-between is it is a very, very slippery thing. A human can exist for a little while in such conditions, but it is a phantom sort of existence. The point of such rambling on my part is simply this: we were drawing very near to this inflection point. Whatever existed in the other reality apparently wanted to see us face to face. The strange daylight seeping in from the spaces ahead was the light of this other realm, filtered through the liminal space. It would be a trite, almost glib understatement to say that we all felt very awed by this point. I can't speak for the others with me, but I felt as though I wasn't entirely real. In contrast, the mind from that other realm began to feel almost tangibly present. We halted at what felt like the threshold. There was the sense that if we traveled beyond this point, we would begin to unravel. So we stood there, half-dazed, staring into the bright abyss. Then we saw something take shape. It was a vague, hazy thing at first, like a living cloud of smoke, yet it came into focus with alarming speed, coalescing into something almost solid. Yet there was something fluid in the way it moved, something impossible and unnatural, as though it was governed by a set of physics that had little to do with our own reality's limitations. The thing had a vaguely human shape, though it also bore great wings. In truth, it reminded me of a medieval gargoyle, or perhaps a demon. Yet there was nothing particularly infernal about it. It didn't seem malevolent, though it wasn't exactly friendly either. I'm not sure it had any real emotions. It was truly difficult to tell, as it had no face. Its hue was also very dark, as though it had been sculpted from shadows. The creature looked at me, though it had no eyes to look with. Yet I felt its attention, its unearthly focus. Ideas flickered within my mind, and the whispers began to make sense despite the unknown language. The winged shadow was something like an avatar, an incarnation of the mind that had been reaching out to us. Its existence had been made possible at last by the study of our equipment. My photoeidetic device is a technology that is influenced by the physics of the in-between. Charlotte's vorpal blade is a weapon that influences the physics of the in-between. These two things together allowed the mind to reach into that realm of physics and create this disturbing incarnation. As I pondered how strong a mind would have to be to will something like that into existence, the truth settled suddenly into my thoughts. This mind was not from the other reality. It was the other reality itself. The adjoining realm was somehow conscious, a living, thinking universe. As this thought became clearly manifested, a great many things began to make sense. A mind such as that would be at once utterly alone, and yet not the slightest bit lonesome. It would have no care for the basic needs of food and shelter. Indeed, it would scarcely even understand them. Fear would make no sense to it either. It might not be able to properly distinguish between any strong emotion. Rage, terror, dread, love, lust, longing, even hunger and thirst might all look very similar. I thought to ask why its avatar had taken that form, and before the thought was fully shaped within my own mind, I felt the answer. Its human features were an inheritance from the human equipment the mind had studied. Its shadowed aspect was drawn from the depths of our own minds. Primal fears buried almost too deep to remember, but still strong and strangely clear. It was at once an angel and a demon, and neither of those things. It was the depth of night that every human instinctively fears, and yet it was something else besides. As I thought about these things, the creature faded back into nothingness, yet the mind that shaped it remained within my thoughts. An uninvited guest who had no understanding of things like privacy or even individuality. If anything, it seemed fascinated by these alien concepts. Deeply curious. That, at least, was a common point we both could understand. I had the sense that we had been summoned to see this incarnation, this avatar, this angel of shadows, as a sort of thanks for providing the knowledge needed for its creation. Yet even this wasn't entirely accurate. It wasn't exactly gratitude, as the mind had no true sense of what that would even mean. Rather, it felt appropriate, or perhaps symmetrical, that we should be present. There was something like a reassurance that Scrimshaw's bargain would be honored. Even now, an elder thing was tasked with sculpting the trinket he'd requested. Though there was no hostility, it still felt as though we were meant to depart at that time. That was simply the way of things. It was time for us to leave because that was the form that reality took. We didn't argue. Really, how could we? So we returned the way we had approached, back to shallower spans of reality. It was a relief to leave that deep passage behind. Even the alien growths of the Eldritch gardens felt reassuring in comparison. Watching the gardeners felt almost calming. It made sense in a way that thing below did not. We are returning to the surface with dubious rewards in hand. Scrimshaw has his desired trinket, though I wonder if he might regret it one day. The statue is sculpted from something like obsidian, though it is tinted with the odd purple-pink magenta hues of this realm. Its form resembles the thing we saw far below, that gaunt creature of the night with its membranous wings and monstrous visage, and yet it also resembles the gardeners, and the elder things, and perhaps even the excavators. It is almost a distillation of all of the monsters below. Yes, I cannot help but think of them as monstrous even now, at least in some senses. We have been treated to their hospitality, and learned more than a few of their secrets, and yet there is something deeply wrong about this place. It is a realm guided all too much by the whims of an ancient mind that cannot understand most human concepts. A mind made curious, a mind that has taken an interest in us. I had thought to capture an image of the statuette, but I can scarcely bear to even look at it. I am almost afraid to use the photoeidetic device in such a manner. It feels as though it might conjure up another of those faceless angels, those demon avatars. We have returned to the surface, or very nearly so. Our guide left us in a small cavern with a rectangular aperture a short distance off. We parted ways amicably enough, though I should note that the creature spoke perfect English as it bade us farewell. As we traveled through the aperture, we found we were no longer in a natural cavern. Granted, it was still a cave of sorts, still carved from solid stone, but the carvings were undeniably human. If anything, the place felt similar to the rooms we'd visited in the ancient stone structures of the oasis, or rather a larger and more intricate version of such stonework. The air was heavy with perfumed incense and a pervasive humidity such as one might find in a bathhouse. Everything was bathed in soft violet light reminiscent of the phosphorescence of the caverns below. Here, though, it was mostly confined to ornate lamps set in various places along the walls and ceilings. Despite the almost civilized setting, there were still plenty of twisting organic forms creeping over the masonry. I wasn't at all certain whether these shapes might be a form of fungal slime or the extensions of roots from great trees just above us or something else altogether. We were suddenly aware of a low musical sound drifting through the air, the sound of an unmistakably human voice murmuring softly in a sort of repetitive melody. A chant, or so it seemed. Following the sound, we made our way through a number of rooms and passages. Then we found the source of this musical cadence. She had her back to us and seemed utterly focused on this strange recitation. Her features were illuminated by strange light which resembled the diffuse luminescence we had seen so very far below. As the stranger came to the end of her chanting, she bowed her head and much of the light faded away. Then she turned and smiled, offering to show us the way out. As we followed in her wake, she explained that her order had long ago made a pact with the One Below All, though that wasn't what they referred to it as. They were to be caretakers of the surface and guardians of the secret. This latter point was of some concern until she quickly pointed out the substance of her recent communion. The Great Mind had told her we were to be escorted safely back to our realm, through the desert and through the gate. Apparently, she'd found such instruction to be very unusual and asked if we were to be detained at any point. In answer, the Mind had suggested that she might wish to depart to our realm with us for questioning its authority. In all honesty, she looked rather pitifully at us, or rather at Scrimshaw in particular. He was soon persuaded to take her on as a guest, at least temporarily. When we said she would need a false name to travel under, she offered the name of Violet, appropriate enough as such names go. When we asked for further explanations of her order, she smiled rather cryptically and gestured towards the book in Scrimshaw's hands. A quick search revealed yet another page with a familiar sort of image. The accompanying notes were illuminating enough, though not altogether satisfactory. There is a hidden aspect to the witches of water. I write this now with the special ink prepared by them. They respect my desires for knowledge, but they value their secrets no less for it. So this is an agreement of sorts. I can write freely in this ink alone, so I write of the formless god that they serve, the One Below All so venerated by the crawling, writhing things of the depths, the living foundation of this realm, or so they claim. A mind of terrible potency, held in check only by its lack of desires. Its only vice is curiosity, or so the witches say at least. I am reluctant to write any further of this thing for now. It is sufficient to say that, just as a different realm lies hidden away beneath the blinding desert, so too a different way lies hidden within these women. Up above they are the water witches, keepers of the oases. Below they are priestesses of a god incomprehensible who worship the formless thing in hidden shrines of violet splendor. We have returned to reality, such as it is. When we emerged into the open air, night had long since fallen. The four of us moved silently beneath the trees, with Violet leading the way towards the desert. She paused only to gather a few personal items before we entered the dark emptiness of the amber desert. The place felt almost painfully lifeless after the abundance of strange life we'd seen in the depths. Still, the air felt fresh and almost clean. Mercifully, it was an uneventful and almost pleasant voyage back across the Mediterranean, towards more familiar lands. I don't think either Charlotte or myself left our home for at least a couple of days after our return. Violet is now a tenant in Scrimshaw Manor, and the four of us have visited together on a couple of occasions now. The mood has been mostly cordial and even happy, though our most recent visit has left me deeply concerned. It was late in the night, well after all four of us had retired to bed. Scrimshaw had appeared at my door and silently gestured for me to follow him downstairs. He led me to a small, isolated study some distance from the main hall. Charlotte was waiting in that room, but Violet was nowhere to be seen. After closing the door and securing it quite thoroughly, Scrimshaw began to speak. He gestured over to a nearby tabletop where the evil-looking little statue now resided. First, he asked if either of us felt anything strange in its presence. There was an uncanny sense of being watched, though I put that down to simple nerves. Scrimshaw seemed to think it was something more. He gestured to Charlotte, who produced a small bundle of wrapped cloth. As she handed this to me, I recognized the familiar form and weight of the object within, my photoeidetic device secretly brought down earlier in the evening. He asked me to try and use it to capture an image of the idol on the tabletop. What happened next should not have been possible. The device should not work within normal, mundane reality. Yet it worked within that confined room. It worked well enough to capture the sight of that idol. Yes, it is an idol, or something rather like one. Something divine or demonic, or both, that enforces that strange liminal law upon its immediate surroundings. A bridge, perhaps, to an ancient mind that encompasses an entire universe just adjacent to our own. Before I could comment on any of this, Scrimshaw handed me his book, open to a page I'd not seen before. It was the last to appear, so he said. Reading it, I can't help but wonder if this entire venture was arranged by something well beyond us. Perhaps we have all been played as little more than absurd puppets on an Eldritch stage. I have little time remaining in which to write. I can say only that I have been blind, and I am soon to return to such blindness. I found the secret hidden within an underground shrine, a record etched into the stone itself in a language not meant for human eyes, yet I can read it for the moment. I wrote the book in this impossible tongue without even realizing I was doing so. Now the symbols are slipping from my grasp, as are all my memories of the world below, yet there are things that I would set down before the end. In times of old, the water witches struck a bargain with the shapeless mind below, the utterly inhuman entity. They would be caretakers of the surface realm and satisfy its curiosity with tales of the world above and the worlds beyond. In turn, they were granted a boon, though they would not say what it was. I have my suspicions, though, as I note that there are no elderly among them. I dare not specify any further, even in this hidden page. The ink fades already before my eyes. It will only be restored when one retraces my steps in full, when one travels below to see what I have beheld. I offer this warning. Have nothing to do with the one below all. It is not a creature of malice, but neither is it a being of compassion. It understands neither of these concepts, and that makes it all the more terrifying to bargain with. As may be somewhat obvious to anybody who has watched a few of my videos, I am a biologist who is fond of Lovecraftian fiction. And now these are not my only interests by any means, but they are significant. All the more so as they tend to go hand in hand. When I was young, I remember delighting in any fiction which involved strange creatures of one sort or another. It might have been speculative biology, or monster movies, or the kinds of short stories once published in Weird Tales. I confess I have not yet outgrown this fondness. Hopefully I never will. Still, I should probably note that such interests have given me a rather odd outlook on horror films. If there were monsters involved, I was watching them rather than the human characters. For me, the monsters were the main characters of interest. Thus, slasher movies always struck me as rather boring. Just another human with a diseased mind wreaking havoc on hapless victims. Hardly worth paying attention to. On the other hand, show me an eldritch alien from the stars, an unknown beast from dark corners of the world, even a supernatural creature from beyond reality itself. Whether cryptid or catastrophe, myth or monstrosity, legend or liminal leviathan, I was interested. captivated. One might well imagine my enjoyment as I found everyday monsters hidden away in biological textbooks. Look at a simple insect up close and you will find a creature utterly different to human expectations. A thing that wears its skeleton externally, has a nerve cord running down its belly, breathes from holes down its sides, and sees the world through a mosaic of faceted eyes. A creature that, in many cases, develops from a larval stage that bears almost no resemblance to its adult form. Compare a maggot and a fly, or a caterpillar and a moth, or a grub and a beetle. One could scarcely believe such disparate forms were aspects of the same creature. But enough of my rambling. It is sufficient to say that I have biological interests that have greatly influenced my fictional pursuits. So I thought I might take the time to explore some of these patterns and connections just for fun. So let us start first with biology and move on from there. At the risk of making a rather obvious statement, biology is the study of life. Now, life is a very complicated thing, with almost innumerable variations upon a few central themes. Life as we know it, at least, is based upon things like a watery medium, carbon-based macromolecules, and cellular structures defined by phospholipid membranes. Organic polymers like DNA, RNA, and proteins feature prominently and form the basis of much of the structure and function in living systems. Within such basic ground rules, a dazzling variety of forms can be found. Beyond this, every living creature is deeply and subtly connected with other living creatures and its environment. Life is woven into intricate webs of almost maddening complexity. Indeed, much of biology consists of shortcuts and generalizations, as a complete comprehension of biological complexity is beyond the reach of the human mind. In any case, with such a variety of forms and so many different sorts of life cycles and associations, it is probably inevitable that at least some of life's patterns will be rather disturbing to human sensibilities. This is where the monsters come in. Now, a monster is a thing that is often easily recognized, but not so easily defined. Setting aside the human types of monster, that is, a person who is particularly evil or psychopathic, let us narrow our focus to monstrous creatures. By some accounts, the term monster is derived from the Latin word monstrum, which more or less means something like a portent or an omen. Something supernatural, possibly divine, possibly infernal. There is the implication of something repulsive or terrifying. A monstrous creature often deviates from proper morphology, having some manner of deformity. It is also not uncommon for a monster to be larger than its more normal contemporaries. So with such nebulous definitions in mind, let us look once more at the natural world. There are a great many forms of life that might easily seem monstrous to human eyes. Deviations and divergences from what we consider to be sane and reasonable patterns of existence. As it turns out, this is especially common in the ocean. After all, most humans don't explore too deeply into the marine realms, as it is not a place we are adapted to survive in for more than brief excursions. So it is unfamiliar, and the creatures adapted to live in such a place will have inevitable differences to what we are more familiar with. One need only look at something like an octopus, a crab, or a sea star to find a creature that differs wildly from what most people would regard as a normal animal. This brings us along to the Lovecraftian monster, the typical Eldritch horror, usually a creature of slime or tentacles or strange symmetries or deformed aspect. I think it is no accident that so many of these particular monsters borrow their appearances from marine life. The ocean itself can be terrifying in its way. Thalassophobia is not entirely unwarranted at times. Imagine being alone in a small rowboat with a mile or two of water beneath you, dark and deep, concealing any number of unknown forms of life. There might easily be leviathans in that unknown abyss, or creatures that defy every human expectation. A suitable stand-in for a vast dark cosmos wherein humanity itself is just a tiny spark adrift in the void. A central concept of cosmic horror. Cosmic horror is an interesting genre of fiction. Much of the dread seems to be centered around the idea of human insignificance within the greater cosmos. This implies a certain futility to our existence, along with the inevitability of unpleasant things happening for no good reason. Sounds a bit like everyday life, if I'm being honest. Still, this futility, this dread, this pernicious nihilism depends upon a fairly common human perspective, the oft unspoken idea that we are at the center of the universe. Now, this makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Every person is essentially confined within their own heads, after all. Our perceptions of the surrounding universe are just that, perceptions. An imperfect model of the actual reality about us. Our own mind is the only mind we are directly aware of, and even then, we're really only aware of a small fraction of our own mental processes. Everybody else, we have to infer from our guesswork. After all, if you're listening to this right now, you're hearing an electronic simulation of my voice, which was in turn provided by pressure waves in the air vibrating a microphone's more delicate mechanisms. This was in turn generated by a series of controlled muscle contractions within my respiratory system, ultimately guided by the precise firing of a legion of neurons within my cerebral cortex. Yet, despite the fact that you are not directly reading my mind, it is my hope that your own mind is making a decent approximation of my thoughts as you listen to these various noises. Or should I say, as the pressure waves striking your eardrums set off a series of agitations of tiny hair cells within your inner ear, leading to a cascade of neural signals interpreted by your own cerebral cortex. Okay, I think we've gotten a bit far afield here. The point is simply this. We are forever stuck within our own heads to some degree, and it takes effort to truly see anything beyond ourselves. Thus, it is very, very easy for anybody to think of themselves as the center of the universe, on an unconscious level at least. To have this implicit assumption overturned is unpleasant and often disturbing. I believe that is what gives the cosmic horror genre its sting. However, what happens if we approach such stories already realizing that we are not in fact the center of everything? We might encounter tales of a cosmos far larger and more magnificent than we could have imagined. There is an almost exultant glory in even a glimpse of the true beauty and grandeur of creation. Thus, cosmic horror has a curious secondary aspect which might be described as cosmic wonder, or even, maybe, cosmic adventure. I suppose that might be why I made this channel in the first place. The living world is filled with wonders, but many of them are very odd to human eyes. There is something to be said for sharing the weird tales of nature. That said, as remarkable as reality can be, there is an undeniable allure in dreaming as well. Thus the liminal biome series I've been making in more recent days. A series of what-ifs, strange realms that draw inspiration from various fictional genres as well as actual biological phenomena. Hopefully people are enjoying these little misadventures as well as the more grounded non-fiction I started the channel with. Anyway, I suppose I've rambled on long enough, at least for now. I might try making a bit of fairly random content as I prepare for the next series of liminal biome videos. Just something a bit different to keep things from becoming too routine or predictable. We'll see what happens one way or the other. For now, I thank you for listening and hope you have enjoyed your visit. Please, by all means, look around the channel if you like and see what other madness I might have on hand.